I never meant for anyone to see me that night. The water was freezing. Even in early October, the Montana air bit into your bones after sunset. But the pool, half forgotten, rimmed with chipped tiles and rust-stained ladders, held something I needed. Not comfort, not warmth, just stillness. I eased myself in, not bothering with a towel or a light. There were no lifeguards here, no noise. The center had long since gone quiet, tucked into its nightly silence like a veteran curling into a bunkered dream. And I'd learned to move like a shadow among those silences, unseen, unspoken. That night, I wasn't trying to die. I just wanted to remember what it felt like to float. My skin stung from the cold, but I didn't move. I curled myself into a shape that used to be a woman, folding arms over breasts, pressing knees to chest. I let the water hold me. That was all. It had been almost 2 years since I'd held my daughter, since her fever took her before a doctor ever had the chance. I didn't cry for her every night anymore. But sometimes on nights like this, it came back not as a sob, but as a tremor. A shiver that had nothing to do with temperature. I didn't hear the footsteps. I didn't see the light in the office window above the courtyard. I didn't know that anyone was watching. That came later. The next morning when I woke up, I wasn't in my own bed. I blinked against soft morning light filtering through thick beige curtains. The room smelled faintly of leather and cedar-old books, and something stronger, bourbon maybe. The sheets were too soft to be government-issued. There was a wool throw over me tucked up to my chin. My clothes from the night before were folded neatly on the wooden bench beside the bed. My hair was damp-brushed. My first instinct was panic. Where was I? Who brought me here? Then I saw it, a note, handwritten in dark, deliberate strokes on thick stationery. The water's too cold this time of year. Please don't disappear. TR. Thomas Rourke, the retired brigadier general who lived in the East Wing. We all knew him, or rather, we knew of him. He didn't speak to anyone unless it was necessary. He took his meals alone. He read books none of us could pronounce the titles of. People said he'd once stared down a sniper through a scope and didn't blink. We were never introduced. I just saw him sometimes walking the perimeter in the early morning, sipping black coffee in the courtyard like the ghosts hadn't won yet. I didn't know he even noticed I existed, and yet, here I was, in his bed, with a note that didn't sound like command or pity, just observation. I got dressed slowly, my muscles still sore from the cold. I didn't fold the blanket when I left the room. I didn't leave a thank you note. I didn't know how. Instead, I walked back across the courtyard with my eyes down and my hands in my pockets. No one saw me. Or if they did, no one said a word. But I knew he had. And somehow, that was worse than being alone. I didn't see him that morning. Not in the hallway, not in the courtyard, not during my shift in the kitchen when I scrubbed the counters harder than they needed, but I felt him like a presence behind glass. Distant, but watching. I kept glancing at the East Wing door, expecting him to appear. He never did. There were no cameras in that room. No staff allowed in unless summoned. And yet, the night before, someone had carried me there. Someone had seen me in the pool, curled like something forgotten, and chosen not to call security. Not to lecture. Just to cover me. The note still echoed in my mind. Please don't disappear. It was a strange thing to write. Not, "Are you okay?" or "Don't do that again." Just a quiet acknowledgement of vanishing. Maybe that was what struck me most. He hadn't assumed I was trying to hurt myself. He'd seen enough to understand I was simply trying to exist without being seen. That afternoon, I passed his office on my way to the laundry room. The door was cracked, a thin line of shadow stretching across the hallway floor. I paused almost without thinking. Through the gap, I saw him. He sat at his desk, not reading, not writing. Just sitting, elbows on the arms of his leather chair, hands, folded eyes staring forward like he was listening for something only he could hear. I should have kept walking, but I stood there suspended between shame and curiosity. Then, without turning, he said, "You're not in trouble." His voice was low even. Not comforting, not cold, just certain. I froze. He continued. I didn't bring you there for any reason other than safety. I didn't touch you except to carry you out of the water. I swallowed my throat dry. I know. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. You didn't, I said quickly. Then softer, I just didn't expect to be seen. He looked at me then. Really looked. Not at my uniform or my posture or my badge. At me. Like he was trying to remember something or maybe forget something else. I didn't expect to see you, he said. But now that I have, I can't pretend I didn't. That's when I realized something strange was happening. Not romantic. Not yet. But something quietly irreversible. We had crossed a line without even meaning to, simply by acknowledging each other's pain. I nodded once, then kept walking. We didn't speak again that day, but everything shifted. The next week unfolded with a strange rhythm. We didn't seek each other out, not really. But I noticed that whenever I passed through a room, he'd already been there. The coffee pot freshly brewed. A book left open on the lounge table, its title circled with a pencil. A folded blanket placed on the bench outside the greenhouse. None of it said I see you. But all of it whispered I remember. I returned the gestures without realizing. A cup of herbal tea left near his chair one evening. A photo frame in the common hall dusted and straightened. A loose page from a military novel refolded and tucked into his mailbox. No notes, no explanation, just quiet echoes. It wasn't a courtship. It wasn't even a friendship. It was two people orbiting the same memory of loss and daring for once not to walk away from it. I still had nightmares. I still cried in the laundry room when no one was around, and I'm sure he still woke at 4:00 a.m. with that haunted look veterans get when they remember too much. But somehow the silence we shared stopped feeling like a wall. It started feeling like a room. One we could both sit in even if we didn't speak. The strange thing about being seen is how quickly it turns into something you crave. Not attention. Not even comfort. Just acknowledgement. Proof that you exist in someone else's frame of reference. After that morning in his bed, after that note, I found myself hyper-aware of the places he might be. The kitchen around 7:10 a.m., always just after the lights flickered on. The greenhouse before lunch. The far window seat in the library where the sun hit the spine of war memoirs like they were holy relics. He was never loud, never abrupt. He moved through the building like a memory present, but never asking to be noticed. And maybe that's why I began to move differently too. We didn't speak again for a while, but we passed each other softly frequently. Like two ghosts haunting the same house but unwilling to admit it was no longer theirs. One morning I entered the main lounge to vacuum and found the fireplace lit. No one else had been there. There was a chessboard on the table, 2 pieces moved, but the game left unfinished. I almost touched it. I didn't. Instead, I turned down the volume of my steps and finished the room without a sound. When I left, the fire was still burning. That same evening, I found him sitting under the oak tree outside reading with a blanket on his lap. The book was open, but I could tell he hadn't turned the page in a while. I think we were both figuring out how to be near each other without asking anything of the other, like neighbors in grief. Then came the cello. I found it during a routine sweep of the back rooms. The music room had been locked for months, maybe longer. I only had the key because the maintenance supervisor trusted me not to break things or snoop. I didn't mean to find it. I was just checking for drafts. The case was tucked behind a piano draped in a sheet like a forgotten heirloom someone had stopped mourning. The air smelled like old varnish and paper, the kind of silence that carried dust on its shoulders. I opened the case carefully. The cello inside was beautiful, deep chestnut wood, slightly dulled with age but still intact. One of the strings had snapped. The bow looked like it hadn't been used in years, and tucked in the velvet lining was a folded page of handwritten music. No title, no signature, just notes. Simple, slow, with markings for emphasis like someone had tried to remember a rhythm too delicate to hum out loud. I didn't touch the instrument. Not yet. I just stood there breathing in the quiet. That room felt personal, sacred maybe. I didn't need to be told it had once belonged to someone who no longer walked the halls. I knew enough about grief to recognize when a space had been abandoned, not because it was forgotten, but because it had meant too much. The next morning when I passed him in the hallway, I almost mentioned it. I almost said, "You should fix the lock on the music room." I almost said, "I think the cello's missing you." But I didn't. Instead, we just nodded. A shared glance. A pause. Like two people carrying the same song in different keys. And for now, that was enough. I waited 3 days before going back to the music room. Not because I was afraid of being caught. No one ever came down that wing. It was tucked behind the administrative offices down a hall, where the air always felt 10 degrees colder and the lights flickered like they were unsure of their job. No, I waited because I wasn't sure what it meant for me to play something again. Before the war, before Lila, before the night the fever took her faster than I could pray it away, music had been the only thing that made me feel like myself. I never studied formally, but I learned enough from watching my mother's hands move across old hymnals and thrift store sheet music. We didn't have a cello growing up, only a battered upright piano missing 3 keys. But I used to imagine what it would feel like to draw sound from strings instead of hammers. When I picked up the bow, it felt like touching something both familiar and entirely foreign, like speaking a language I hadn't used since childhood. I didn't tune it, didn't dust it. I just sat on the bench, took a breath, and let the music on that folded page guide me. The melody was simple, a lullaby maybe, or something that had once been. The kind of tune you might hum without realizing while folding laundry, brushing your child's hair, lighting a candle at dusk. I only played for a minute, maybe 2. The string was still broken, so I worked around it. Adjusted, filled the gaps with silence, which somehow made it feel more honest. When I stopped, I didn't move. The room was thick with something that wasn't quite memory, wasn't quite regret. Just wait. Then I heard it. A breath behind me. I turned. He was standing in the doorway. General Thomas Rourke, stoic, unreadable, tall as a pine tree in a storm. His arms were at his sides. His face was unreadable. But his eyes, they weren't cold. They weren't even surprised. They were wounded. "I'm sorry," I said, standing too fast, the cello slipping slightly against my thigh. "I didn't mean to." He shook his head once. "Slow. That song," he said, voice lower than usual, like it was trying not to crack. "She used to play it." I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. I just waited. "She never gave it a name," he added after a moment. "Said it didn't need one. Said it was for him." He didn't say the name, but I knew him was their son, the one who didn't make it back. The cello stayed in my lap, warm now from my touch. I didn't move to leave, and he didn't ask me to. I didn't know, I whispered. He nodded slowly. "You weren't supposed to." Something in my chest loosened just a little. He stepped further into the room but didn't sit. He didn't touch anything, just stood there looking not at me, but at the space I had just filled with sound. "I haven't heard it since." He trailed off, then shook his head like the thought was too unfinished to say aloud. "It's a beautiful piece," I offered. "She wrote it after the funeral," he said. "Played it once, then never again." We were silent for a long moment. Then he looked at me. Not the uniform, not the cello. Just me. "You didn't ruin anything," he said quietly. "You reminded me it was still there." And with that, he turned and left the room. No lecture, no awkward goodbye. Just that single line left hanging like the last note of a song that hadn't yet faded. I didn't expect him to invite me in. Not to his private wing. Not to the room that no one else had likely stepped into since the funeral. But one evening, after a quiet dinner shift, he found me folding blankets in the common room. He stood there holding a worn leather box in both hands like it might fall apart if he wasn't careful. "I need you to see something," he said. "Not want, not thought you might like. Need." I nodded, unsure what I was agreeing to. but I followed him without hesitation. His quarters were neat in the way military men keep things: squared corners, polished handles, not a speck of dust on the mantel. But the air was heavy, as if grief had settled into the wallpaper. He placed the box on the coffee table, unlatched it slowly, then stepped back. I sat. Inside were letters, hundreds of them. Some typed, some handwritten, some scrawled on hotel stationery, post-its, scrap pages ripped from paperback novels. They weren't addressed formally, just names at the top. Ben, kiddo, son. Some had dates, others didn't. None were sent. I picked up the first envelope on top. It wasn't sealed. None of them were. The ink was faint, the writing deliberate. I saw a boy today at the grocery store with the same laugh as yours. It stopped me cold. I had to walk out before I scared someone. Another. Your mother still leaves your plate at the table on Thanksgiving. We pretend it's for the dog, but we both know better. And one more, shorter than the rest. I don't know how to stop talking to someone who's not here anymore. I couldn't breathe for a moment. My throat closed around a lump I thought I'd buried months ago. Maybe years. I looked up at him, but he wasn't watching me. He was staring out the window, arms crossed, jaw set, like a man refusing to break under his own weight. How long? I asked softly. Since Kandahar, he said almost without sound. 5 years. He was 23. He nodded. I didn't ask more. I didn't need to. The letters were his way of keeping the door cracked open, of not shutting out the voice he missed most, of holding on to something when everything else felt like it had slipped through his fingers. And in that moment, I saw myself in him more clearly than I had ever seen my own reflection. I had never written letters to Lila. I'd buried every word I couldn't say to her deep in the hollow between exhaustion and guilt, tucked them into the rhythm of cleaning rooms and counting supplies. Pretended forgetting was healing, but it wasn't. Watching him stand there, unapologetic, unguarded, I realized what I'd been doing all along. I hadn't been surviving. I'd been erasing. And suddenly, I didn't want to do that anymore. I reached across the table and touched the corner of the box just lightly, like asking for permission. May I? He gave a small nod. I pulled out a folded sheet with ink smudged along the margin. The words were short, uneven. It was your mother who wanted a son. I was terrified of not knowing how to raise one. Then you came, and all I could think was, how did I ever live before this? I let the paper fall gently back into the box. You loved him like I loved her, I said. He looked at me then. Really looked. Not with pity, not with sorrow, with recognition. And that somehow hurt the most and healed the most. We were strangers not long ago. Now we were mirrors. And that changes everything. We didn't talk for 3 days after the letters. Not out of avoidance. Just silence that felt fuller than words. But I couldn't shake the image, those envelopes without stamps, that steady way he opened the box without apology. I kept thinking about how brave it was to write to someone who couldn't write back, to admit you still needed to speak, even if no one answered. It made me realize I hadn't said my daughter's name out loud in almost a year. Not even to myself. Not in prayer, not in memory, not in regret. That's how grief works sometimes. You don't bury people, you bury syllables. Until even your child's name becomes a landmine you step around. Her name was Lila. She was 3.5, and she had the loudest laugh for such a small body. She loved purple jelly beans and hated wearing socks. Her favorite song was one I made up on the spot while brushing her hair. I told all this to him on the 4th night. Not because he asked, but because we ended up on the back steps of the greenhouse, me with a chipped mug of tea, him with his usual black coffee, both pretending we weren't avoiding sleep. The crickets had gone quiet early that night, and the only sound was the hum of the heater from inside. I didn't look at him when I started speaking. I just stared at the gravel under my shoes. I crossed the border with her in the middle of the night, I said. She was wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too big. Her fingers were cold. She didn't cry, though. She thought it was a game. He didn't interrupt. I kept going, voice steady like reciting from a report I'd written 100 times and burned each copy. She got sick a month later. Just a fever. But we didn't have insurance. I was afraid they'd report me if I took her to a hospital. I waited. Too long. I finally looked up. His eyes were on me, not sharp, not soft, just steady. She died in my arms, I said. In the back of a borrowed car stuck in traffic. I tried CPR. I knew what to do. I'd done it on wounded soldiers. On children. I did everything right, and still. I let the words hang. I didn't expect comfort. I didn't want it. I expected silence, maybe. Pity at worst. What I didn't expect was what came next. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and said quietly, "I didn't make it to Ben's last call. I missed it by 9 minutes. 9 minutes. That was all. No lecture. No cliches. No offers to help me move on. Just two people sitting in the wreckage of different losses, neither trying to fix the other. For the first time since Lila's death, I didn't feel like a criminal for surviving. I didn't feel like a bad mother or a coward or a shadow. I just felt like someone who had loved deeply, and lost deeply, and was still here. That's when it happened, quietly, invisibly, but fully. Trust. Not the kind that's spoken, signed, or proven. The kind you feel when someone doesn't flinch at your brokenness. The kind that settles into the space between words and says, "You don't have to carry that alone anymore. We didn't touch. We didn't cry. We just stayed outside long after the tea went cold." And when he stood to go back inside, he paused beside me and said, "I'm glad you told me." 3 words. But to me they meant, "You're not invisible." The message came just after noon. I was in the staff kitchen rinsing out a tea strainer and humming half of that melody from the cello room. It had become a habit, music filling the space that words still couldn't. My phone buzzed once, then again. I almost didn't check it. Most messages were appointment reminders or community center updates. Nothing urgent. Nothing real. But this one was different. A simple text. No punctuation. No emojis. Just 5 words. "She's gone. Peacefully last night." It was from a mutual friend, someone who barely kept in touch anymore, someone who didn't know what Anna meant to me. I stared at the screen for a full minute before I realized my hands were shaking. The strainer slipped from my fingers and clattered into the sink. Water splashed across my sweater, but I didn't feel it. Anna had been more than a friend. She was my witness. The only person in the world who had seen Lila alive on this side of the border. The one who held her while I slept, who stayed up watching cartoons with her when I had overnight shifts cleaning hotels. The one who didn't ask how I got here, only what I needed now that I was here. She was the last thread tying Lila's life to mine in the real world. And now she was gone. I don't remember grabbing the glass. I just remember it shattering. The sound was sharp, jarring. My hand was bleeding, palm split by a curved edge. I gripped the sink for balance, but the room kept spinning. I couldn't breathe, couldn't cry. My mouth opened, but no sound came. I sank to the floor, knees hitting linoleum, one arm cradled to my chest, the other wrapped around my ribs like I was holding myself together. I stayed there for I don't know how long. Long enough for the blood to cool. Long enough for the shame to creep in. And then I heard footsteps. Heavy, measured, familiar. He didn't say a word. Thomas Rourke stepped into the kitchen, looked at the shattered glass, the blood to the phone still lit up on the floor. Then he crouched beside me slowly, like you approach a wounded animal you don't want to frighten. He didn't reach for me. He simply offered the first aid kit from the cabinet with both hands open. I took it. My fingers brushed his. Warm, steady, human. We didn't speak while he helped me bandage the cut. He just moved with the calm precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times for soldiers and never asked why they got hurt. When he finished, he sat on the floor beside me, back against the cabinet, knees drawn up like mine. I turned my head to face him. She was the only one who knew. His eyes didn't waver. Now I do. I exhaled. Not a sigh. Not a sob. Just breath. like I'd been holding it for hours. She braided Lila's hair every morning, I whispered, even on days I couldn't get out of bed. He nodded once. She said if I ever disappeared, she'd find me. Bring me back. You didn't disappear, he said. You're still here. The silence after that wasn't empty. It was weight-bearing. I leaned my head against the cabinet. He leaned his against the wall. And we just sat there, two people in a kitchen with blood on the tile and grief between them, not trying to clean it up, not trying to fix it. Just letting it be real. We stayed there for a long time. The linoleum was cold beneath us. My knees ached from the hard floor, and the scent of blood still clung faintly to the air despite the bandage. But neither of us moved. Sometimes being witnessed is more healing than being held. He didn't ask for the story behind the glass. He didn't ask about Anna or how I knew her, or why losing her cracked something inside me that I'd fought so hard to keep together. He just sat beside me, back straight, palms resting on his knees, his breathing calm and deliberate, as if offering stability by example. And somehow, that mattered more than words. I could feel the pulse in my bandaged hand, slow throbbing, like my body was reminding me I was still alive, even if I didn't want to be reminded. Rourke didn't reach for me at first. But after a while, after the silence had softened into something almost sacred, he shifted. One slow movement. No warning. He lifted his right hand and placed it palm down gently over my uninjured one, not gripping, not enclosing, just covering. His hand was warm, rough with age and weather, steady in a way mine hadn't felt in years. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I just stared at it the way our skin looked together. His larger, darker. Mine pale, lined with tiny healing cuts. Two hands that had held too much and lost more. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't rescue. It was a recognition. The kind of gesture you only make when you've run out of things to say, but still want someone to know they're not alone. I closed my eyes just for a moment. Not to escape, but to stay. To breathe in the strange safety of being allowed to fall apart and still be seen. When I opened them, he was looking straight ahead, not at me, not at our hands, just forward, as if his presence was the only promise he had left to give. I turned my hand slightly, letting my fingers settle beneath his. And he let them. That's all we did. Sat like that, hands barely joined, surrounded by silence and fluorescent kitchen light, like two survivors who had finally stopped running just for a minute. Eventually, I spoke. My daughter used to say Anna smelled like warm paper and cinnamon. He smiled, faint but real. I can imagine that, he said. It's a good smell. She always told Lila stories about butterflies that carried messages between mothers and daughters. He nodded. She ever tell you any of those? I shook my head. No. She said they were only for kids. Well, he said, voice steady, but low. Maybe Lila knows more than we do then. That made something in my chest break and mend at the same time. I didn't cry. Not then. But my hand pressed a little harder into his. Just enough to say thank you without having to say it. He didn't pull away. We didn't talk about what that moment meant. We didn't need to. Later, I stood first, wiped the floor, threw away the broken glass. He helped quietly, his movements efficient, practiced like muscle memory, from a life where messes had to be cleaned quickly before anyone else noticed. We didn't mention the blood again, but after that night something shifted. Not love, not yet, but the sense that maybe we could occupy the same quiet space and not drown in it. I saw him before he saw me. It was late morning. The kind where the sun hangs heavy and slow, like it's watching you, rather than warming anything. I'd just finished wiping down the front lobby desk and was heading toward the greenhouse when I noticed a figure leaning against the front gate, bored, slouched, familiar in a way that made my stomach knot. He wore a faded army jacket, sleeves pushed up. His hair was shorter than I remembered, peppered with gray, but his eyes were the same, restless, twitchy. Like he was always 5 seconds from starting a fight or a lie, maybe both. His name was Jesse Vaughn. We'd served in the same forward operating base in Ramadi. Same year. Different units. He wasn't someone I talked to, but he knew me. More importantly, he knew about Leela. I froze behind the tool shed and watched him scan the property with the lazy arrogance of someone who'd never earned his place, but always expected one anyway. I wanted to disappear into the gravel. But then he turned his head and looked directly at me. Smile. Slow. Sharp. Ellie Cruz. He drawled as if tasting the name. Didn't expect to find you in a place this quiet. I stepped out from behind the shed, spine straight. Jesse. He approached like we were old friends, hands in pockets, nothing urgent in his gait. But his eyes, those were hunting eyes. What brings you here? I asked flatly. Oh, I was in the area. Heard this place took in all kinds of broken pieces. He winked. Figured I'd fit right in. I didn't smile. You're not a resident. You shouldn't be past the gate. He shrugged. Rules never stopped you before, remember? My throat tightened. He was baiting me, waiting for me to react. You're not supposed to be here, I said again this time. Firmer. He leaned in, lowering his voice. I remember that night. The truck. The kid in the blanket. You think you were subtle? He smirked. You weren't. You broke orders, risked lives, just to smuggle some sick kid across a checkpoint. My jaw clenched, but I said nothing. You think no one ever kept track of where you ran, after he added. You think a pretty sob story keeps people from talking. What do you want? He straightened, eyes gleaming. Nothing. Just wondering if this fine place knows what kind of ghosts you bring around. Wondering if he knows. He didn't say Rourke's name. He didn't have to. That was the threat. Not exposure. Embarrassment. Contamination. He turned, hands raised like in surrender. Just saying hi. I'll show myself out. I didn't stop him. Couldn't. I waited until his boots disappeared behind the gate before I let my hands tremble. And later that night, when I sat in the music room pretending to read sheet music, I couldn't shake the image, Jesse's smirk, his warning, the way he said, you think he knows, because no matter how far I had come, part of me still believed I didn't deserve this peace. And worse, I believed I might poison his too. He found out before I told him. Of course he did. This place was a fortress, but not to him. Nothing passed through its gates without brushing the edge of his awareness. Rourke may have retired from command, but his instincts never clocked out. It was barely dusk when I saw him in the courtyard, shoulders squared, gaze locked on Jesse Vaughn, who for some reason had come back. I stood behind the utility shed again, just out of view. They didn't yell. Rourke didn't need to. He walked up to Jesse like a man used to having his presence settle arguments before a word left his mouth. Jesse, for all his bravado, straightened like a schoolboy who realized the principal wasn't here to joke. I couldn't hear the full exchange, but I caught enough. You don't belong here. Just catching up with old friends. You had no intention of catching up. You came to threaten. Jesse scoffed, but his weight shifted backward, betraying something less confident than his smirk wanted to be. You think you're protecting her? He asked. You don't even know the whole story. I don't need the whole story to know you don't deserve to be in it, Rourke said. That shut him up. He left again. This time faster. And Rourke stood there staring through the gate like he was willing the world to stay out just a few more hours. I didn't speak to him that night. Not at dinner, not in the hallway. I couldn't. Not with the shame pressing against my ribs like a growing bruise. But the next morning I found him sitting in the chapel room, empty, cold, unused except on holidays and funerals. He looked up when I walked in. His face was unreadable. I sat 2 pews behind him, hands folded tight. You shouldn't have to defend me, I said quietly. He didn't turn. I wasn't defending you, he replied. I was defending the truth of who you are now. But people don't care about who I am now, I said. They care about what I did then. About what I broke to save her. His voice was steady. You saved your child. That's not a crime in my book. In the military's book it was. Then maybe their book is wrong. I looked down at my hands. They could reopen things, I said. Dig it all up. They could come after this place for harboring someone like me. This place isn't afraid of ghosts, he said. No, I replied. But I am. He finally turned then. Of what of ruining the one good thing I've found since her? He was quiet a long moment. You think I can't handle it? No, I whispered. I think you shouldn't have to. His eyes softened then just a little. Enough to make it hurt worse. I made peace with what I've lost, he said. But I haven't made peace with watching someone else disappear. I stood. I had to. If I stayed, I'd cave. And if I caved, I'd ask him to carry a weight that never belonged to him. I'm not disappearing, I said. Just stepping away before I infect this place with what I've been running from. He didn't stop me. And that was the worst part, because it meant he understood. I packed light, just a duffel, a notebook, and the one photo of Lila I still had tucked between 2 pages of sheet music I never learned to play. I left a note on the piano bench. Just one line. Thank you for seeing me. I walked out before dawn. Didn't look back. Didn't cry. But God, it felt like leaving her all over again. The town was small. One of those borderside places where the wind carried more dust than sound, and the roads bled into the desert without apology. The clinic sat at the edge, a low beige building that looked like it had been forgotten by every agency except the one barely keeping it afloat. It was exactly what I needed. I arrived 2 weeks after leaving the center. No questions asked. They needed someone who could run triage, clean wounds, translate, refill bandages. I knew how to be useful without taking up space. I didn't tell anyone about the music, about the cello, about the man who once sat beside me on a linoleum floor and didn't say a word while I unraveled. I didn't talk about Lila either. I worked 10-hour shifts, sometimes longer. I slept in a cot in the back room, ate saltines for dinner, and drank black coffee out of plastic lids because we kept running out of cups. I memorized the names of every child that came through the door with a cough, a bruise, or a mother who hadn't slept in 3 nights. I was kind, efficient, quiet, and I never played a single note. The cello stayed in my mind like a ghost limb. I could still feel it when I closed my eyes, the curve of the wood, the soft resistance of the strings, the echo it left in the room. But I never reached for it again. Music felt dangerous now. Too close to remembering, too close to hoping. I also stopped writing. No more notes, no more letters, no more words meant for the dead. It was easier that way. Cleaner. Some nights when the generator hiccuped and the lights blinked off for a few seconds, I let myself imagine he'd walk through the door, not to bring me back. Just to sit across from me again, silent, steady, unflinching. But he never came. And I never told anyone about him. I was surviving. And that was enough. Or so I kept telling myself. Then one day, a boy came in with a fever. His name was Luis, age 5. Eyes too big for his face. His mother clutched his hand like a lifeline. She barely spoke. Just pointed at his forehead and whispered something I knew too well. Está ardiendo. He's burning. We laid him down on the cot. I checked his vitals. Stable, but spiking. I reached for the cool cloth and paused. He looked like Lila. Not exactly. Not in the features or skin or hair. But in the way he held his mother's pinky with all 5 fingers. And for the first time in months, something cracked. I excused myself to the back room, closed the door, sat on the floor, and cried. Not the quiet tears I used to let fall in the laundry room. Not the frozen, controlled kind. This was shaking, heaving grief, the kind that grabs you from the ribs and doesn't let go. When it passed, I picked myself up, wiped my face, and returned to the boy's bedside. I stayed with him until he cooled. But I couldn't unfeel what had just broken open. The silence I'd built wasn't peace. It was exile. And somewhere beyond the dry air and border checkpoints and dead-end towns, a man still kept a cello in a room that hadn't been played in since I left. I didn't know if he was waiting, but I knew suddenly and with painful clarity I wasn't done being heard. I didn't see the truck pull in, didn't hear the gravel shift beneath its weight. I was sitting at the back of the clinic, my lunch untouched beside me, watching two lizards chase each other across the cracked stucco wall. The heat shimmered in waves across the sand, turning even the cactus spines into liquid lines. Then I heard a familiar knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the frame of the open door. I turned. He stood there as if no time had passed at all. Rourke. Same coat, same boots, same face carved by wind and war and too many years without sleep. But in his arms, awkwardly, almost protectively, was a cello case. I didn't stand, didn't speak, because I didn't know how to breathe. He stepped in like a man entering holy ground. No rush, no assumption. He set the case gently on the cot beside me, then sat on the edge of the windowsill. "I don't expect anything," he said quietly. I looked down at my hands, suddenly unsure what to do with them. He continued, his voice low. "I had it fixed. Thought maybe one day you'd want to hear it again. Or maybe I just wanted to know it wasn't broken anymore." I looked at the case. Same one I'd seen every week in the corner of his music room, too dusty to open. Now it gleamed clean, the brass clasps polished. Reverent. "You drove all this way?" To return that I asked, barely above a whisper. "No," he said. "I drove all this way to ask for a seat." I blinked. "A seat?" He nodded. "If you ever decide to play again, I'd like to be there. Just once." There was no desperation in his voice. No plea, no poetry. Just a request. Plain. Honest. Heavy. I opened the case slowly. The cello looked like it had when I first touched it that fall in Rourke's music room, restored, waiting, almost shy. I touched the bow. My fingers trembled. "I haven't played since You Don't Owe Me a Song," he interrupted. But I shook my head. "No. I owe one to her. And maybe to myself." I tuned slowly. Muscle memory took over where faith had long since departed. When I pulled the first note from the string, my throat clenched. The sound wasn't perfect. My hands shook. The bow slipped once, but Rourke didn't flinch. He didn't comment, didn't breathe too loud. He just sat there still and listening. And I played. Not the whole piece, just the part I remembered. The part where grief used to grip my chest and now loosened. When I finished, I didn't look up right away. The last note rang longer than it should have. Then silence. Not the kind I'd been drowning in. Not the kind that closes doors. This silence was different. It was held. Shared. He stood after a moment, walked to the door and paused. "I'll head back in the morning," he said. "Unless you'd rather I stayed." I didn't answer. He didn't wait. Just nodded once, left the cello beside me, and stepped back into the sunlight. I didn't sleep that night. But I didn't cry either, because I knew now sometimes the sound doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be heard by the right person. I didn't tell anyone I was coming back. I just packed a single duffel, gave my clinic shift to a young volunteer, and took the overnight bus that stopped only when the driver lit a cigarette out the window and muttered, "This where you're getting off." The gate to the center still creaked the same way. The porch still held that dent in the third step. And the garden, well, the garden was thriving. I found him kneeling near the lavender bushes, sleeves rolled, dirt streaked along his jaw like war paint. He didn't look up right away. Just said, "The rosemary survived the frost." I smiled. I guess some things do. Only then did he rise, turning to face me. No surprise in his eyes. No need to ask why I came. He simply tilted his head toward the house. Rooms still made up. We didn't hug, didn't cry, didn't kiss. We just continued. Weeks passed. Maybe months. Time bent in that place, slow, wide, forgiving. I took over the old art room and converted it into a music space for the local kids. The piano was missing 3 keys, but the kids didn't care. They liked when I brought the cello, especially the little girl named Myra, who insisted it sounded like trees breathing. Rourke started keeping bees. Said it gave him a reason to move slow. He'd come back with 3 stings and a smile, drop a jar of amber on my windowsill, and walk away before I could say thank you. We never said the words people expected. Not together. Not in love. Not forever. But he'd leave his coffee for me when mine burned. And I'd leave a folded scarf on his chair when his neck stiffened in the cold. Once I found my old sheet music tucked between pages of his gardening log. Another time he came in after my cello class, sat down without a word, and picked up a child-sized tambourine. The kids giggled. He shook it once. Offbeat. I raised an eyebrow. He tried again. Better. Still off. But the room was full of laughter, and for the first time in a long time I laughed with them. He didn't stop coming after that. Sometimes he sat and listened. Sometimes he hummed barely audible to songs I didn't know he remembered. Sometimes he just existed beside me, and that was the most I ever needed. One night while closing up the music room, I asked him, "Why did you keep that cello?" He paused, thinking, "Because even broken things deserve not to be thrown away." I nodded. Neither of us was whole, but we weren't discarded. And somehow, in the quiet between melodies, the notes we played together felt like pieces of ourselves offered without fear of rejection. We never put a label on it. Not lovers, not partners, not anything that could shatter under definition. But every time he passed the window of the music room and nodded at me, every time I set 2 chairs out in the garden instead of 1, every time the bees buzzed, the children sang, and the cello hummed under my fingers, I knew we were exactly what the other needed. No more, no less. And sometimes, that was everything. It rained that night. Not a storm. Not thunder and rage. Just soft, steady rain, like someone drumming their fingers on the roof to remind us the world was still moving. The kids had all gone home early. Power flickered. Rourke lit candles not out of necessity but habit. He moved slower these days, like he was afraid of startling the quiet. I was tuning the cello when he appeared in the doorway. He didn't speak. Just looked at me like the room was safer because I was in it. He reached for the old violin that hung dusty on the back wall. I hadn't seen him play it once since I'd come back. I wasn't sure it still held tune. I haven't touched this since he began. I raised a brow. Since he gave a half smile. Since the last time I believed music could change anything. I didn't say what I wanted to say. That sometimes music doesn't change the world. It just makes surviving it more bearable. He sat down across from me. I played the first note. He matched it hesitantly. The harmony wavered, then found itself. It wasn't a polished performance. It wasn't meant to be. We stumbled. Laughed once. Adjusted. And then somewhere in the middle of the 3rd verse we found a rhythm. It was like we'd rehearsed it a lifetime ago. Like grief had tuned us to the same key. The candlelight made everything look warmer than it was. His hands, once calloused and tight, now moved like they remembered softness. My fingers, long stiff from withholding, loosened into surrender. When we finished, we didn't clap, didn't move. We just looked at each other in the flickering dark. No labels, no promises, just presence. Then he stood, walked over, and without asking, without testing the air like men often do, he placed his hand at the side of my face. I didn't pull back. He leaned down, not hungry, not eager, not demanding, but with the reverence of someone who knew the value of what he was touching. And he kissed me. Slow, still, solid, like a vow made not in words, but in patience. It wasn't about want. It wasn't about escape. It was about recognition. That we had both survived something. That we had both been quiet for too long. That we had both waited in different ways to be seen, not for our pasts, but for our still breathing present. When we parted, he didn't say, "I love you." I didn't need him to. Because the silence that followed didn't feel empty anymore. It felt shared. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of nerves, not because of fear, but because I realized in a world where everything is labeled, measured, and explained, we had built something that refused to be boxed in. Not a relationship, not a rescue, not a second chance, but something quieter, truer, harder to break. Like music played on a rainy night meant for no one but the two who heard it. And maybe that was love too. There were no guests, no flowers, no white dress, no vows, no priest. Just a note pinned on the board at the center music recital at dusk. All are welcome. No one knew it was a wedding. Not even us, at least. Not in the way people expect a wedding to be. We wore what we always wore. He in that faded linen shirt that always smelled of rosemary. Me in the blue wrap dress the children called Miss Ellie's lucky color. The old pool was behind us, drained, repaired, and now a sunken garden blooming with wild mint and morning glories. No longer a place for weeping. Just life finding its way through cracks. Rourke set 2 chairs in front of the open field. One for him, one for me. But before we sat, I brought out the cello. No microphone, no stage, just candlelight. And the hush of a town that had come to listen without knowing why. I didn't play anything dramatic. No Mendelssohn, no Bach, just a lullaby. One my mother used to hum, one my daughter never got to hear. One that lived somewhere between the ache of goodbye and the calm of staying. As I played, I felt them all. The ones we had lost, the ones we had become, and the ones who had quietly and stubbornly chosen to remain. Behind me, I heard Rourke breathing in time. Slow, grounded, present. When the last note fell into silence, he stood. No speech. He simply walked to where I sat, crouched down, and kissed my hand. Not like a husband, not like a soldier, just a man full of history and hope, acknowledging another soul who had made it this far. Afterward, the children clapped. The locals cheered, not knowing what they were celebrating but feeling instinctively that something sacred had happened. We didn't tell them. We didn't need to. Because we knew. And that was enough. Later that evening, I walked alone to the edge of the garden, the place where I had once cried into cold water, aching for a world that had moved on without me. Now it bloomed with violets. I sat down, pressed my palm to the stone rim, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me go, without letting me drown." The stars blinked above, quiet and unbothered. From inside, I heard Rourke tuning the violin. He was never very good at it, but he tried anyway. And that was the real vow. Not perfection, not forever, just the choice to stay over and over again. We sat by the pool again, the same spot where it had all begun, same hour, same hush, but everything else had changed. The garden had softened. The stones no longer bit at my skin. Even the air felt less heavy, as if grief had taken off its boots and decided to walk barefoot for a while. Rourke poured us each a cup of tea. No fanfare, just habit. His fingers brushed mine briefly. It still startled me how steady he'd become. Not in a loud way, just constant. He stared ahead, watching the last light dip behind the hills. I watched him. I always did that now, not because I was afraid he'd vanish, but because I no longer needed to look away. And then I asked it. The question I'd carried in my chest for too long. Do you think she'd be proud of me? My voice barely rose above the wind. He didn't answer right away. Just leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands folded like prayer or surrender. Then he said, "No." I turned sharply. The breath caught in my throat. He glanced sideways, the corner of his mouth twitching. "I don't think pride is the right word." I blinked. She wouldn't need to be proud, Ellie. She'd just know. I swallowed hard. Nobody met my eyes. That her mother doesn't cry alone anymore. The air left my lungs like someone had gently pushed it out. It wasn't a grand revelation. It wasn't poetic. It was just true. So many nights I had begged the universe to let her forgive me for surviving, for not being able to save her, for moving on. But maybe she didn't need me to be forgiven. Maybe she just needed me to be whole. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a small brass key, faintly tarnished, a little bent. It used to open the practice room at the old clinic, a room I hadn't locked once since the day we painted it with sunlight and cello strings. I held it up between us. "I don't need this anymore." Rourke looked at it, then at me. "You're sure?" I nodded. "I'm not hiding anymore. Not from the past. Not from her. Not from myself." He didn't take the key, just watched me gently set it down on the stone ledge. We sat there a while longer, not saying much, not needing to, just listening to the way the world exhaled, the quiet rustle of grass, the creak of old wood, the hush of a heart that had finally learned to rest. Before we left, he stood and offered me his arm, but I didn't take it. I stood on my own, walked beside him, not behind, not holding, not needing, just beside. And as we stepped through the garden gate, I looked back one last time. The pool didn't weep anymore. It had bloomed.